Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And today I am pleasure to rise and speak on the Liberal government's Bill C-56, which is an act to amend the Competitions Act and the excise tax. But, Madam Speaker, this is yet another kind of a half-baked, half-measured bill from the Prime Minister to solve an affordability crisis that he himself and his government have created. And after 8 years of inflationary taxes and out-of-control spending, Canadians have now found that they can't afford this government. They can't afford housing, they can't afford fuel, and they certainly can't afford food. What makes this bill that much more frustrating, Madam Speaker, is the fact that the Liberals are adding more bureaucracy to try and solve a problem that they themselves created when there's actually a very quick measure that they could enact today that would reduce costs for Canadians significantly. And that is by eliminating their inflationary Carbon Tax 1 and Carbon Tax 2. And in fact, these two carbon taxes and the inflationary aspect to them are making life unaffordable for Canadians. But we saw today in a report by the Financial Post that their new initiative, the Canadian Sustainable Standards Board, is actually going to exacerbate those costs on Canadians, especially when it comes to food costs, and is going to add additional bureaucracy to every industry, every commodity, asking them to identify the impact of carbon on every link in the supply chain. This is going to add so much red tape and so much bureaucracy and so much onus on every industry, creating every manufacturing every product and growing every commodity. It is going to make life even that much more unaffordable. But the interesting thing is, Madam Speaker, is they are implementing or imposing these punishing carbon taxes on agriculture, for example, which one of the industries that we are a world leader in, world class in terms of our sustainability, our emissions, and our ability to grow food with the lowest carbon footprint in the world. Now, the data is painfully clear on what the impact the Liberals' Carbon Tax 1 and 2 are having on Canadian farm families. According to the Canada Food Price Index, a 5,000-acre farm will be paying $150,000 in carbon taxes every single year. Wow. There's not a farmer that I know that can absorb those types of costs and still remain economically viable. And that is the question I think that the Liberals seem to always forget. They talk about sustainability. I think they get a quarter for every time they say that, but they never talk about economic viability. When you impose these new regulations and these new taxes on industry or on agriculture or on energy, you are impacting their ability to remain economically viable. The Parliamentary Budget Officer also just published a new report confirming the correlation between inflation in Canada and the suffocating carbon tax on farmers. Diesel will go up 70 cents a litre, and gas in many provinces has already exceeded $2 a litre. When I was in Vancouver a couple of weeks ago in the GVA area meeting with some farmers, $2.08 a litre for gas. Unbelievable that you're now expecting Canadians to absorb that and still be able to put food on the table and pay their mortgage. And this year alone, the carbon tax collected from farmers just from on-farm propane and natural gas was $50 million. Now, I find it interesting that the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change said in his speech on Thursday that, whoa, I don't know why you guys are so excited. The carbon tax doesn't impact farming. Well, the statistics from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the Canada Food Price Index, and the stats from just about every commodity group in the country says otherwise. The reason for this is we brought forward Bill C-234 that will exempt the carbon tax from natural gas and propane, because they are still paying the carbon tax on those two fossil fuels, because there's no alternative, Madam Speaker. They need these fuels to heat and cool their barns, dry their grain, and power their irrigation equipment. This isn't something that Conservatives are tossing around. These are indeed the facts. But you think those numbers are bad, Madam Speaker? Hold my jerry can. The newest Parliamentary Budget Officer report on the impact of the carbon tax on farming said between this year and the year 2030, agriculture will be paying $1 billion in carbon taxes alone. And for the Liberals to say, oh, but, you know, these costs on farmers, which they don't even believe exist, but the Parliamentary Budget Officer confirms that they do exist, well, that's not impacting the price of food. That's not having any any reason we're seeing these high costs of groceries at the grocery store shelf. I don't know anyone other than maybe the Liberal and NDP government and their coalition that thinks adding additional taxes will somehow reduce prices. But that's exactly what they're saying. As part of this bill, or part of this discussion, the Prime Minister has threatened the CEOs of the major grocery chains in Canada, if you do not stabilize grocery prices by Thanksgiving, there will be tax consequences. So he's threatening to increase taxes on the grocery store CEOs and the major chains in Canada. Now, is there an issue with competition in Canada? Yes, I would agree with that. We need to do things to improve competition in Canada, which always brings down prices. But does the government honestly think, truly believe, that if they increase taxes on Sobeys and Loblaws and Costco and Walmart, that they're just going to absorb those additional costs? Of course not. They're going to pass those on to the consumer. There is not a scenario where an industry just says, you're right, we're going to pay more taxes, thank you very much. Of course not. They're going to pass those on to the consumers, and that's going to drive up costs even higher. But what I want to emphasize here, Madam Speaker, is the very real life consequences these taxes are having on those that we're relying on to grow the food that we use to feed our families, and certainly plays a key role in Canada's ability to help feed the world. A fruit and vegetable grower in my riding showed me their power bills for the last few months. They were paying $5,000 a month in carbon taxes alone, plus $800 of GST on top of that carbon tax. So tax on a tax on a tax. They have now decided to close their market in the winter months because they simply can't afford to stay open. That is fresh fruit and vegetables at a nearby farmer's market and grower that my rural constituents were able to go to without having to drive into the city. Well, that's now going to be closed, forcing constituents to drive even further. Makes a lot of sense if climate change and reducing emissions is your goal. A farmer in southern Alberta told me he paid $140,000 in carbon taxes last year, meaning he couldn't invest that money in new equipment that would have been more energy efficient, more fuel efficient, and more frustrating for this grower is he was hoping to have that money put aside for his daughter who wants to take over the family farm. She would have been the 5th generation to take over that farm. Now, instead of having that money to invest in his operation, improve efficiency, reduce emissions, help the next generation, that has gone where? To the Liberal government, into general revenue. In fact, again, if reducing emissions and addressing climate change is your ultimate goal, this is doing the exact opposite. In a grocery store, this is kind of the other interesting thing where they want to increase taxes on the grocery CEOs. Well, many of the grocery stores in Canada are actually local franchisees who own those grocery stores. One of the larger Sobe operations in my riding, I went to visit him last week, seeing how things were going. His energy bill has gone up $6,000 a month as a result of the carbon tax. Wow. He's trying to absorb those costs because he's a local store owner, a local business owner. But he says, eventually, I'm going to have to pass this on to the consumers, or it's going to have an impact on what I can pay my employees, or what I can contribute to local community initiatives, service clubs, the sports teams, youth organizations, all of those things which they try and help support. But the Liberals think that these costs are just magically absorbed by those farmers and those small business owners. Shameful. But of course not. These costs are passed on to the consumer, and that's why we see apples up 61%, carrots up 72%, oranges and potatoes up 76%, and just in time for Thanksgiving. The Liberals need to realize when they increase the food on the farmer, on the trucker, on the manufacturer, and on the retailer, those costs are passed directly on to the consumer. And the Canadians are paying the price for that. And we're seeing that with millions of Canadians. 7 million Canadians last year went to a food bank. In Alberta, food bank use is up 70%. The food bank in Calgary is supporting 700 families every single day. Numbers that I know food banks across the country have never seen before. Madam Speaker, in conclusion, if the Liberals really cared about grocery prices, if they really cared about family farms, they could do something right now. Eliminate their carbon taxes, certainly their plans to quadruple that carbon tax, And that will make food more affordable for Canadians, not more red tape and bureaucracy.
Well,